Building secure software is of paramount importance in a world that is on an accelerated digitization path. Welcome to the Purple Book Podcast, where we host thought leaders and security practitioners to tackle the monumental challenge of building secure software. Our mission is to spread awareness, challenges, and best practices in secure software development. This show is your guide to hearing inspiring stories of leaders building secure software against odds, and getting to know the personal stories of these leaders who make it all happen. Here are your hosts, the members of the Purple Book community.
Hi, I am your host, Raj Patil. I'm based in Silicon Valley, California. I'm the executive chair at the Purple Book community. This podcast is part of the Purple Book community, which is a community of some of the world's top security leaders. And these leaders have come together to write a book about software security. And though it started out as an endeavor to write a book, it has then since grown into a community, a big community of 150 plus leaders now. And we talk about application security, product security, DevSecOps, pretty much everything under the sun about related to software security. And this book is supplemented by blogs, podcasts, panel discussions. So coming to the podcast today, our guests today are Cassie Crossley, who is a director of product and system security at Schneider Electric. And then we have Piyoush, who is head of infrastructure and security at Zora. Cassie, Piyoush, welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you, Raj.
All right. Yeah. So it's been when we started writing the book, January of 2021. And it's been quite an interesting journey from the initial discussions about what the book should cover to what the chapters should be. I remember when we started out, it started out as a book with 4 chapters. And as it happens with diverse inputs coming in, it's now a book with 10 different chapters in it. And today we are going to talk about a very important chapter out of that book, which is on the supply chain security. And Cassie, who is here, he's an expert at that. And in fact, SBOM, even people could spell what SBOM is. She was espousing that cause for a long time. And SolarWinds just put that in focus. And since then, she's been very busy, I know, traveling across the length and breadth of the country, championing the SBOM cause here. And with Piyoush, I have known you for a little over a year and a half now. And you have authored the process chapter. We have a separate podcast coming on that in itself. We'll talk about that later. But Cassie, so let me start with you.
Yes.
Yes. So Cassie, I remember, I think it was back in fall of 2020, Nikhil and I were talking to you and we talked to you about the idea of a book. And we talked to you about the idea of a book that would be useful for software security because we realized nothing like that existed. And I very distinctly remember you had that bookshelf that you have to your right, and you pulled out one book from there. And you said, hey, Raj, Nikhil, if you're going to write a book like one of these 4 books. I've been to like 100 events in the last 25 years, and most of them, I just trashed them on my way to the airport. These 4 books have made it. And that gave us the vision on what this book should be. It should be a book that will become a handbook people will refer to, right? So that's where the journey started. So thank you for that inspiration. So if you were to share your experience, what would you say about your experience being part of this book writing and the community?
Well, the community is excellent. When I first met Nikhil, and I explained to him what I did being on the application and product security side and having been on the CISO side before, I said it's difficult to find people that want to have the conversations that aren't focused only on identity management or different topics that are very prevalent in the IT security space. And when we talked over time and discussed how I couldn't find really my community. I think that was also one of the prompts for really getting this together. And when he mentioned to create a community to endorse that, where it's not a technical community per se, because we have the OWASP community, we have BSync, we've got different communities at that level, but we didn't have really one for the leadership that are concerned both on the CISO and app security side. So I was really excited when we had the community start together. And it's a great blend and excellent sharing. And then when we were talking about the book itself, I said I didn't have a book that I could hand to others because I work with a lot of other companies. I work with hundreds of suppliers. And also for investments, we have what we call our ecosystem, where these are companies that we either invest in or we work with that are Schneider owned, but they don't necessarily have product security or full app security teams. And being able to explain what is happening in this world when there wasn't really before SolarWinds much attention in that space, it was difficult. So I was really proud that we have the Purple Book community and now the Purple Book itself.
Yeah, fantastic. It's been quite a journey. I remember how the chapter came about and everybody was rooting. We definitely need to have a chapter on the supply chain security.
Yeah, I believe I was first dedicated to the process chapter. And I said, I've got, we need this other chapter. I'm having this conversation a lot with people, and I'm starting to do presentations on supply chain security. And software security is its own supply chain. In regards to suppliers and moving it through, whether you're then working with cloud vendors, Azure, AWS, they are your suppliers, and they're just as important to your supply chain security as if you build a physical product like we do quite a bit, where you're giving it to manufacturing teams and other suppliers to burn chips, firmware onto chips, that kind of thing.
Right. Yeah, totally. I remember it was January, February of last year. We are fresh off of SolarWinds the previous December, right? Very interesting discussions here. So before we go into greater detail, Cassie, I always ask the guests of my podcast so that we know you better. Can you share one experience in your life that has shaped you most in becoming the person that you have become now? One experience.
I think it comes to, it's hard to define an experience, but my dad, a single experience, but my dad was a programmer at IBM, a very quiet guy, had patents. He was just a genius technically. And so I had planned to follow in my father's footsteps, not realizing that I was an extrovert and I liked to work with people, and sitting down, I became a software developer, and sitting down and coding for 10 to 12 hours a day was not my thing. And I asked him one day, and I said, why am I having such a hard time? I know you're in management now, and that's not your desire. So, why don't you like to manage people? Like, this is project management, technical management of, development, engineering management. I loved. And it was really at that point in time, I guess, when I realized that this whole world of technology needs people like him and needs people like me. That I work with the geniuses, the architects, just the brilliant scientists all the time. And they don't necessarily want to be in meetings 8 to 12 hours a day. They want to concentrate and really get into it. And then there's me, who can understand that technology and can present to boards whatever is necessary. And I have them as part of my team, and we're co-leaders in a lot of cases. And it really takes all kinds. And I guess now seeing that was a pivotal moment to really understand that not everybody wants to be the front face, and not everybody wants to be behind the scenes, doing all the technology and the brilliant work that they're doing.
Totally. Yeah. Beautiful story, Cassie, especially if there are people listening in to see there are different talents it takes to bring this security world together, right? Thank you for sharing this experience.
You're welcome.
So Piyush, coming to you, I'll ask you the same question here. Can you share one experience that has shaped you most to be the person that you are right now?
Absolutely, Raj. And first of all, let me say thanks for inviting me. And Cassie, it's been a very wonderful and enlightening journey to be a part of this amazing community and book. You've been a source of inspiration. So thank you.
Thank you.
As Cassie mentioned, there's probably multitude of events that help shape who we are. One that kind of sticks out in my mind is this goes back to my early childhood. My grandmother came from a very humble background, and she did not know how to speak English or write or any of those things in English. She knew the native languages. And one of my cousins mentioned to her how she's unable to be considered literate because she doesn't understand and speak or write English. My grandmother decided at that point to learn to sign her name in English in less than a year. And she accomplished that. This is when she was in her 70s, right? And to me, it had a profound impact. It told me that there's no real limit to learning. We need to constantly learn and better ourselves. And it's something that's I've followed through my entire life. Even today, probably as I get as old as she did, I don't think I will stop learning. That's brings me into being part of this great community.
Yeah, totally perfect. I think security is such an amazing place, right? It will not let you sit quiet. You have to learn. You have to constantly outwit the adversaries out there. Perfect. Thank you so much. So, Cassie, coming to the chapter now on supply chain security, right? So, can you take the audience through what was going through your mind when you're writing? Because it's a very complex subject, right? Now you have to distill it down to what it is. Of course, there's more to it than what we see in the chapter, but you had to distill it. What went through your mind, and how did you decide this is how it's going to be organized?
Well, the organization I really thought about it as the people, process, and technology, overlaying a life cycle. So there's the life cycle part of it, which many of us know, just this software development life cycle. But then there's a secure development life cycle. And when I was looking at the chapter concept, it was not only the life cycle, but all of those different pieces. So when you overlay process, which is, let's say, an SDL, secure development lifecycle, along with the people, because there's many different, let's say, touch points. And I'll talk about that a bit more later. But then there's also the technology. And we're very focused, a lot of security folks, on the technology itself. But unless you can really utilize that technology, it makes a difference. And one of the ways I've structured the chapter is to go over those concepts, but also in this chapter to talk about the risks themselves, why you should be interested in it, and potential control points. And when we talk about control points, that could mean a process change or technology introduction and such. And so I wanted to be able to provide that. The chapter is not extremely technical in nature, in the respect that it's not talking about how to set up a CI/CD pipeline, continuous development work, but it does talk about the needs for that. So I had a good time writing the chapter because a lot of these different ways, when you're introducing these concepts, is if you're thinking about an overall kill chain from a security perspective, it's more than just past the threat model. And so I had to examine the entire potential kill chain through it all.
Yeah, thank you. And in terms of implementing, you probably have dealt with a lot of people, different organizations, just as part of exposing the SBOM cause, right?
Yes.
Your supply chain security cause. So what do you think are the top 3 challenges for organizations to implement something like this, and ways to work on them?
Okay. I would say one of the top challenges is just lack of awareness. We have trained, our computer science programs are just now beginning to add cybersecurity topics into it. And even if they do add cybersecurity topics, there's generally not instruction on how to build threat models or projects where they're building threat models and looking at defense in depth approaches, which could be more than just within that application, but of course the infrastructure. If you're building a cloud application, you need to think beyond just the code you're writing. You have to be worried about the infrastructure, any types of services that are involved. It's a lot more than what is generally taught. And just in certain companies, we work with a provider of application security training, and that provider has in their catalog 50, 80, I don't even remember the full catalog of how many courses there could potentially be just in secure development lifecycle. And so I think that that is a big part of the adoption, is if you are working with, let's say, a startup or another group, you may have developers that are very good at programming for their cause and for their skill set and what they're working on, but they may not have had training on different threat techniques. They may not have had training on the OWASP top 10 or even further. So there's a lot to do so that we can shift left, as we love to say, as much as possible, the security points and where they're building secure code from the moment that is written, and the design itself where security is in mind. And so I think that's number one. Number two is there is so many people involved. I talk about in a supply chain talk that I give that I was one of the original developers that helped put code into Microsoft Paint. So if you have a Windows computer, you probably have lines of code, along with thousands of programmers that have code on your laptop or in your servers. And all of those people together have over time contributed to what you're doing. And if you then add the multiple layers, let's say if you Azure, or let's say you're building a firmware product, you have manufacturing, think about the thousands upon thousands of people that might have, had an impact to what has been constructed. That's very different than when you think about supply chain for, let's say, a piece of rice. It was grown, it was harvested, it was packaged. There's a few major touch points. It could be a couple dozen. But if you look at a cell phone, think about all the touch points that were in there and all the operating systems and apps on it. It's massive. And I believe that the world, as they're starting to see, even the best intentioned, code is never bug-free. And from a security standpoint, we all realize that there is no perfect secure products and applications and systems and so on. And it takes quite a bit of due diligence to that. And so that leads me to the third major reason is the amount of due diligence required to check all of those points. It can be overwhelming. They can be time consuming. They can be costly. And we don't have, it's not where everything's AI driven. It can be very manual in certain respects to understand where there could be gaps. You need to make sure that you have a well-rounded, secure layer, both on the systems that you're working on, how you're promoting them, where your code is being placed. And that all takes quite a bit of harmonization across all of those, because let's say your Active Directory is not very strong. It doesn't matter how strong your code repository may be. If you don't have the right access control or other areas in your build system, then you can be impacted if someone infiltrates your system and gets to your development environment.
Right. Yeah. I mean, just thinking about all these problems, each one of those is a formidable problem to solve in itself, right? So we'll come to how to solve about it in a bit. So Piyoush, what's your take on these three questions? Would you like to add anything to it? Or
One thing that both Cassie and you alluded to, Raj, is while we look at these things in isolation, they themselves are extremely challenging. But when you look at the cumulative risk factor that comes about when you add them together, it takes things to a whole new level. Nowhere has this come out more strongly than the most recent software supply chain issue, which is Log4j. It has basically thrown open that door of, oh my God, do we know all the places where we are impacted? And as we were, different organizations, as I talked to folks in the industry, were going through their own risk assessment, it turned out there are certain areas which they do not even have control or realize that they have a risk. As more and more companies go into the cloud, there is an underlying infrastructure that runs the cloud environment, which can have additional risks that are not under the control of the consumers, of the companies who are consuming the cloud resources. But then we tend to ignore or not pay enough attention to those risk factors.
Yeah, very well said. I mean, like, it's still fresh in our mind, the December of 2021, when each one of you, I'm sure, and every security leader that we talked to was literally sleeping few hours a night and then just trying to get a handle on that. So now that we have all gone through that experience, right? And maybe the need for SBOM and software supply chain security is drilled home even more. So what do you think we could do in the next, let's say, 3 months to a year, and maybe later on 5 years, right? Because these are big problems. What do you think can be done in the next 3 months to a year to make sure that when the next Log4j2 event comes, we are better prepared?
Well, I believe that just as 5 to 10 years ago, we really started to focus on IT asset inventories. First, it was laptops and servers, and then it expanded more to even printers because they're IoT devices these days. That we really need to look at the software asset inventory and not just the application name itself, but the software bill of materials that talks about what's in it. So making requests of your suppliers to understand what are the operating systems, if it's an embedded type of operating system, what is the infrastructure that it's supported on, what is their potential use of open source, not only from a license standpoint, but from a, are you prepared to do updates and patches, in the case of something coming through from a CVE that's potentially could be a critical exploit. So understanding what you have in your environment is expanded. I do not believe that the tools themselves have caught up to that. I've talked with several IT asset management companies and OT asset management, and while they are very clear on, I've got this device and can get certain information, is being able to link that information from a software bill of materials, it's definitely ways to go. For example, if you haven't been patching an OT device and you want a software bill of materials and someone hands you one from the current release, well, what if the architecture was different and definitely the version of it, because as we saw the Log4j, version 2, and then there was some version 1. You need to understand, because as products get upgraded and applications get upgraded, it's not like a cloud environment where, the current version is the current version. Is that you could have multiple versions in your environments, especially anybody in a hospital environment that has specific, very controlled patching practices where they're keeping, they go through a rigid testing process and certification process before deploying those patches. So they may be several revs behind and not on the latest security updates as it is. The software bill of materials and truly understanding what's in your walls and basically in your environments that you're dependent on is very, very important. I think that, CISA has the working group for cloud starting up. I think the dependency on that, there's absolutely from the infrastructure and the cloud and let's say the SaaS provider, that's their responsibility. I don't necessarily need to see every, their SBOM at that level, because I'm not bringing it into my environment. I have my own concerns that I need to worry about, which is what's within my walls that I need to have, as a wonderful CISO told me, I need to know where to put my eyes if something happens. I've got my SOC in place, but if I've got to put eyes on a dial, I need to know about it, because I might not be ready to patch it at that exact moment, but I need to be aware of what's going on.
Right. So based on what you're saying, it seems like the tooling has not kept up, and it's just this huge amount of software inventory that we need to get our arms around, right? So is this mostly a manual process now of going through things?
It's not fully manual. There's definitely agents and asset where it can examine the asset. The tying into the correct SBOM would be manual. And I think we're just maybe 2 to 3 years away where it's more easily connected. But we have the complication for just the namespace complication. Just like if you go out to a URL, you type google.com, it can, the DNS, it'll figure out how to get there. But how do you know, anybody who's worked with a product, if you've ever had to change the product name itself, or you went through an M&A or something, it could have multiple versions of titles of the product name or incorporation over a decade. So how do you really label that and tie that asset, which could have a very old company name on it, to a new? I mean, look at Meta, right? So just that the namespace makes it complicated and makes it not where yet we don't have a place to register those. So there are conversations about how to do some of that registration. And I think those all have to happen fairly quickly, where we can say, these are all the aliases associated with this.
Right. Fantastic.
An interesting question comes to mind, Raj, on this one. And Cassie, I would like to ask you this one. You talked about the SBOM and building that repository, if you would, with the asset management. But I see two challenges. One is we first need to educate and change people's mindset. It kind of brings me back to the times when we first launched DevSecOps, DevOps, Agile, CI/CD pipelines. It seems like we are now going back to that era, but for software supply chain security.
Yes.
And then the second part of that, which is where I would like to know your insight, is how do we go about addressing third-party risks in this, right? I've got my code libraries up to snuff. I've got secure code scanning. My CI/CD is all set up in a way that I can leverage the SBOM. But then I'm using a package which has, maybe a downstream effect.
Yeah.
How can we accomplish the same level of assurance 2, 3, maybe even 4 levels down in our packaging?
It's very difficult. Let's talk about 2 different types. You've got the commercial packages. So let's say that you're working with whether it be large vendors, and you can consider, Azure or AWS a commercial package. Is just a huge, massive one. But then you could have libraries that you've purchased. You could have different components that have their own embedded firmware. Let's say you're building a product that has an Intel chip. There's software on that chip, right? We had it when Intel had to do updates a couple years ago because of something, in the actual chip itself. It's very difficult. You can manage it through assessments and specific requests of reports and, if allowable, penetration tests. But it's always a risk equation. If I am working with a startup that's providing a library or something, I have to be very concerned about, have they even put this through any, code analysis and static code analysis and DAS tools and such? And I have to ask them the specific questions. You have to honestly go in assuming the worst at this point when it comes to suppliers. And that's really taking it to the open source, same thing. You have to make the assumption that there could be unknown attack paths in there, that you don't want to necessarily include every part of that library. Only use what you absolutely need to. It used to be we would pull down the whole package and put it in there because all of the intricacies. You don't want to exclude something that doesn't, that might break it in the way it was released. But you have to be very conscious. And I do believe that that's a growth opportunity for no matter what, making sure that you're not referencing public libraries, that you have you've got your own instance of libraries that it's gone through full scanning. You've done code reviews, you've walked through it, you've analyzed it just as if it was your own code. And we've been, as a development society, sort of assuming that somebody else was taking on that risk or doing it, or we might have just been blind to it. And we can't. We have to assume that there is risk in anything that's provided to us. With your commercial layers and your commercial libraries, setting up the right contracts, the agreements, cybersecurity agreements that they have, SLAs for patching for vulnerabilities, especially critical vulnerabilities, that you have that service in place with them in case they need to make some specific updates for a security reason. So it is a challenge. I don't see this really ever going away. The tools will improve to locate and find. I mean, we've seen a vast improvement on that where, it can generate then 2,000 CVEs and you have to wade through it. So tools such as tool companies, such as like Armor Code, can really help with that noise. But no matter what, somebody has to really understand what's included and accept that risk because there will always be risk.
I agree. Thank you. That's helpful. And just to add to what you just said there, it really touches upon all the three core components: people, process, and technology. And it requires a shift, a paradigm shift in how we approach these three pillars when keeping software supply chain security in mind. Yes. It's requiring us to reassess, the vendor risk assessment has to shift. The technology, the tools have to adjust to this new reality, and the people have to change as well. We need now folks who have the skill sets to be able to recognize that there's a downstream impact to those packages.
Yes. One of the things I like to mention to the developers is someone's going to take what you've compiled and signed and do something with it. So imagine where it may go in an environment, but what if somebody hampers it? So really getting them involved, because to them, code signing, it's a necessary evil, right? I've got to do it. But the impact downstream, if you tell them 30 people are going to potentially have an opportunity where they're going to be moving this or such. And this, that's what DevSecOps really is. I would say there's so much more control than you do when in current environments that are still like your iPhone. How many times was the potential that somebody could have gone into that OS or any of those apps on there as it went through its route? And so what were you going to say, Piyoush?
I was going to ask about, as we go through this SBOM area, right? You mentioned secure code scanning and secure code libraries. Yeah. And to your point, that is an opportunity because not every organization can run their own secure code library repositories.
Right.
That's a massive uplift.
Yes.
In which case, how do we address it? Is it something that the industry has to come together as a whole and say, look, we are all in this together. Let's set up some common standards and frameworks that help address these areas?
Well, I think we've definitely already seen that with Apache and Linux and different areas. I think that one has to be extremely cautious for those that are uncontrolled from a library standpoint. And you should, even in the smallest organization, have some understanding from an open source, where are the risks? Like if you've got a library that, it looks like the greatest library, and it's only been in existence for a short time, there's not a lot of contributions, you don't, there's no referenceable products that it's already included in, you've got to shy away. But you're right, there's a lot of just honestly overhead that I think that some of the vendors are starting to look at, but they're really working at an enterprise level and making less of an area where it can help out startups and smaller companies. And one of the things that we can continue to do is stand up, or support organizations that can also take ownership of these. And again, looking at the actual suppliers, there's tools now that can tell you, okay, everybody that's code committed, they'll attempt to search out the countries of where that person was when they did the code commit through IP and all of that. And that's a very interesting point for certain governments, as they want to understand, are you using any open source and where is the code commits coming from, which comes to a bit of the provenance question.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, thank you. I mean, this is such a vast subject with so much to cover here. Maybe we can plan one more session here. It's quite clear that one session is not enough to go through the whole chapter. So I have one final question for you before we end. And that question is, it seemed to me like the amount of work that needs to be done is so huge. And there was a time, even when we were doing the Log4j2, that each company among the members that are part of the Purple Book community, we saw that everybody was having their heads down trying to solve the problem. And then we called them, we had a meeting where we called and said, let's have a debrief so that we can learn from each other, right? There's a power in the community coming together and helping each other out, right? And it seems like when it comes to taking an inventory of all the software that's there, it's just a huge amount of work, even when there is some amount of automation involved. Do you see that has a Purple Book community or a group of people can come together to maybe help each other out, right? Not everybody has to do the whole thing themselves. Do you see a role for community in something like this, rather than each enterprise trying to deal with it themselves or a security leader dealing with it themselves?
I think so. And that's honestly what first it was the NTIA and now the CISA. It's a working group. It's anybody that wants to participate. There's people from all over the world in these communities. And I believe several of the Purple Book members and people who were part of that working group are now Purple Book members, not just myself, are coming together for those discussions, because this is, again, it's not a truly only IT security conversation. While these benefit IT security and situations, SBOMs and how it all came about is just to be able to understand our own footprint of what's in our products, creating that software component list. It should have been basic standard protocol, but there wasn't really a way that you could have it standardized between different teams. So now we've got minimum elements for SBOMs. There's ways to provide them to other folks in a common format. And I think that as a tool, concept and conversation, the Purple Book community, whereas the CISA community, which is definitely led by the government, they don't want to endorse commercial vendors, but it's important for us to talk about what we're seeing and how we're experiencing. And that's the value of having the Purple Book community, of just like we used to do with, which SSO tools are you using and which, what are you using for this or that? Now the conversation is which tools can do that. There are lists of these tools, but there's not enough people using them yet to even give that feedback. And having a community that is a bit open and closed, where you can have those conversations and explain the good, the bad, and the ugly, is very important. And again, that's the brilliance of having a community where you can share that without having, you're not just having vendor presentations, right? We're living it and we can talk about it.
Yeah. Fantastic. You captured the spirit very well. How about you, Piyoush? What do you think?
I completely agree. It's one of my main reasons, and I would say motivations that came part of this community, was it's our strengths combined together with the decades and probably centuries of experience between the entire group here. And every time we have Log4j was a big one. for everyone. And that's when the community really did come together to share our insights into how can we in the future address this. What I see is these kind of get-togethers with our community as it grows, becoming more and more regular and more prevalent, because the threats are not going to end. They're only going to become more extreme, more sophisticated attacks. Log4j was one of the, I would say, tip of the iceberg. And as these get worse and worse, no single human being can really hold their own in this tidal wave of attacks. So we need to be together, and this community has been at the forefront of collaboration and sharing our insights and our experiences.
Fantastic. Very well put, Piyoush. That's our been our experience too, right? It's just heartening to see the members engaging. What I see in the community is the spirit of giving is very strong, right? That's very important. That's why we have every panel discussions every first and third Thursdays, 5 p.m. to 6 p.m. that experts come out and share, and others come share their perspectives. We have blogs, podcasts that we have here, right? The spirit of giving is very strong. So that makes me very hopeful that we can together, when the next Log4j to happen, we'll be better prepared. We are going to grow in strength as we go. The dialogue is going to get wider. More talented people are going to be part of this dialogue. Thank you very much for your time today. Really appreciate it. Great conversations here. Hopefully we'll meet again soon to continue this conversation.
Absolutely.
Thank you for having me, Raj.
Thank you. Bye. Thank you for listening to the Purple Book podcast. Building secure software is in our hands, as the discussion showed. We all can come together to democratize the process of securing the software itself. So you can join the community at the purplebook.club. If you're interested to be part of this dialogue, it's thepurplebook.club, not .com, the club. Until next time, take care.
Thanks for listening to the Purple Book Podcast, home of the world's top security leaders. If you enjoyed this episode, find more content from our experts at thepurplebook.club. Remember, it's thepurplebook.club, not .com. Follow us at the Purple Book Community on LinkedIn and Purple Community on Twitter. Until next time, these are your hosts and guests signing off.